Once upon a time, in the peaceful town of Ibadan, there lived a hardworking woman named Joy. She was a talented baker known all over the town for her delicious cakes and pastries. Joy worked day and night, baking for birthdays, weddings, and big parties. Even though she was so good at her job, she didn't have a car or anything to carry her trays of baked goods. Every day, she walked long distances through the busy streets of Ibadan, balancing heavy trays on her head and arms. It was tough, but Joy never complained. She loved baking too much to let her struggles stop her. One sunny afternoon, Joy got a special order. She was hired to bake for a grand party at the home of Mr. Johnson, one of the richest men in Ibadan. His big house was far away, near the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees. Joy couldn't carry everything on foot this time, so she paid a motorcycle rider to take her. The journey wasn't easy. The motorcycle broke down twice, and they had to stop at checkpoints where police asked questions. By the time Joy reached Mr. Johnson's house, her dress was dusty, and she was sweating. Still, she smiled brightly as she set up her table. Soon, the sweet smell of her cakes filled the air, and all the guests couldn't stop talking about how amazing her baking was. Mr. Johnson watched Joy work. He was impressed by how hard she tried, even though he could see how tired she was. After the party, as Joy waited for the motorcycle rider to come back, Mr. Johnson called her over. "Joy, you did a fantastic job tonight," he said with a kind smile. "But I saw how hard it was for you to get here. Someone as talented as you shouldn't struggle like this." Joy nodded shyly and told him she was saving money to buy a car one day. Mr. Johnson grinned and pointed to a shiny blue car parked near his shed. "Take it," he said simply. Joy's eyes grew wide. "Sir, this is too much," she exclaimed. But Mr. Johnson waved his hand. "I have plenty of cars, and this one just sits there getting rusty. Take it, or leave it to gather more dust." Joy fell to her knees, thanking him over and over. "God bless you, sir," she said, her heart full of joy. She drove the car home that night, feeling like her life had changed forever. When Joy got home, her friends gathered around the car, amazed. "Joy, is this really yours?" her friend Lisa asked, touching the hood. "Yes. Mr. Johnson gave it to me," Joy replied, still in shock. For days, Joy drove her new car everywhere, delivering cakes faster and easier than ever before. Her business grew, and she was so happy. A week later, Joy got a big order to bake for a celebration in a nearby town called Oyo. Excited, she packed her cakes into the car and started driving. As she drove through a quiet road, something strange happened. The car's horn honked all by itself. Joy thought it was just a glitch, but then she heard a soft voice whisper an address over and over. She shook her head, thinking she was tired from working late. But suddenly, the car jerked, and the steering wheel locked up. Joy's heart raced as it stopped right in front of a street sign. She looked at the sign and froze. It was the exact address the whisper had said. She checked her phone map. She had never been here before, yet the car had brought her straight to this place. Curious and a little scared, Joy decided to find out more. She walked up to a small house that looked neat and clean. A car was parked outside, and she could hear voices inside. Nervously, she knocked. A young man opened the door. Joy smiled awkwardly and said, "Sorry to bother you, but my car stopped here, and I was wondering if you know someone who can fix it." The man's face changed. He stared past Joy at the blue car and asked, You came in that car?" His voice sounded shaky. Joy nodded, confused. The man's eyes widened, and he shouted, "Stay away from me." Then he slammed the door in her face. Joy stood there, stunned. Her heart pounded. Why did he act so scared? She turned back to the car, feeling uneasy. The air felt heavy, like something bad was nearby. Her phone rang, and she jumped. When she answered, a strange voice said, "Run." Terrified, Joy hopped in the car. It started moving again, and she drove as fast as she could to Oyo. When she arrived, her customer was angry. "Where have you been?" "The party's almost over," she yelled. Joy apologized, unloading her cakes quickly. Her hands shook as she thought about the car. She didn't want to drive it home, but she had no choice. On the way back, something even worse happened. As Joy drove, she felt the car shake. Then, hundreds of ants crawled out from the dashboard, covering her legs and arms. She screamed, swerving side to side. The tiny ants tickled and scared her. She slammed on the brakes and jumped out, brushing at her body. But when she looked down, there were no ants. Was she going crazy? The car's horn honked again, and the same strange voice whispered, "Get in." Joy stepped back, tears in her eyes. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She decided she had to return the car to Mr. Johnson and ask him what was going on. With all her courage, Joy got back in. The moment she did, the car started moving by itself. She grabbed the steering wheel, but it wouldn't turn. The engine roared on its own, taking her faster and faster. Joy screamed as it raced back to that strange house. When it stopped, the door of the house was slightly open. Trembling, Joy got out and walked inside. The house was silent. She tiptoed through the rooms, wondering why the car brought her here again. Suddenly, she heard a car outside. Panicking, she hid in a closet. Peeking through the crack, Joy saw the same young man walking. He looked terrified as he called someone on his phone. Joy couldn't understand the language he spoke, but his voice shook with fear. After the call, he grabbed his keys and ran out. Joy waited until he was gone, then crept outside. The car's trunk popped open by itself. Her heart raced as she looked inside and saw a dirty, stained handkerchief. It smelled old and wrong. Joy knew something terrible was connected to this car. But then, something even stranger happened. As she reached for the handkerchief, the ground beneath her feet rumbled. A small crack opened in the dirt near the house, and a tiny wooden box slid out. Joy's hands shook as she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a locket with a picture of a young girl, and the initials SJ scratched on the back. Joy's breath caught. Who was SJ? She tucked the locket into her pocket and decided to take the car back to Mr. Johnson. She drove back to Ibadan, scared but determined. Just as she neared Mr. Johnson's house, she saw the young man driving out of his gate. Joy froze. What was he doing here? Did Mr. Johnson know him? Too many questions spun in her head. She decided to go home and think. That night, Joy couldn't sleep. The car, the man, the address, the locket, it was all linked somehow. The next day, Joy went to see Mama Ruth, an old woman in Ibadan who knew many secrets. Mama Ruth had once helped Lisa find her stolen phone when the police couldn't. Joy parked the car outside Mama Ruth's shop and told her everything, how Mr. Johnson gave her the car, the whispers, the ants, the strange house, and now the locket. Mama Ruth's face grew serious. "My child, this car has a dark past," she said softly. She pulled out an old newspaper and showed Joy a story. 5 years ago, a girl named Sarah Johnson, Mr. Johnson's only daughter, disappeared. The last time anyone saw her, she was driving this same blue car. Joy's stomach dropped. "Sarah Johnson, SJ," she whispered, pulling out the locket. Mama Ruth nodded. "People say Mr. Johnson did something bad to Sarah to become so rich. Others think the car was part of it. Sarah vanished the day he bought it for her." Joy remembered the stained handkerchief and felt sick. She told Lisa later, who gasped. "Mr. Johnson sacrificed his own daughter?" Lisa asked. Joy nodded. "Mama Ruth thinks so. And this car is haunted because of it." Lisa had an idea. "I overheard Mr. Johnson's wife, Mrs. Clara, at the market. She's planning to leave him. She thinks he's hiding something. Maybe she can help us." Joy wasn't sure, but she had to try. The next day, she met Mrs. Clara at the market pretending to shop. "Men like Mr. Johnson think they can do anything," Joy said casually. Mrs. Clara looked at her. "What do you mean?" Joy took a deep breath. "I have proof he's not a good man. His daughter, Sarah, the car she disappeared in, is with me. I found a stained handkerchief and a locket with her picture." Mrs. Clara's eyes widened. "Show me," she said firmly. They went to Joy's house, but the car was gone. Joy panicked. "It was here this morning," she cried. Lisa told her to hide at her place. As they planned, Mrs. Clara called. "My husband's acting strange. He left after a phone call. Be careful." Just then, men burst into Lisa's house with sticks. Joy and Lisa froze, but one man stopped. "Joy," he said, surprised. Joy recognized him. She'd given him bread years ago when he was hungry. "You helped me once," he said, lowering his stick. "I can't hurt you." His men were confused, but he ordered them to leave. Joy asked, "Why does Mr. Johnson want me dead?" The man shook his head. "I don't work for him. I work for Mrs. Clara." Joy gasped. "What?" The man explained, "Mrs. Clara killed Sarah, not Mr. Johnson. Sarah wasn't her real daughter. Mrs. Clara's baby died at birth, and she swapped it with Sarah. When Mr. Johnson left everything to Sarah in his will, Mrs. Clara got jealous and killed her." Joy felt faint. "She fooled everyone," the man said. "She made it look like Mr. Johnson did it." The man gave Joy photos of Sarah's grave, at the strange house's address. But then he added a twist. "There's more. Mrs. Clara didn't act alone. She had help from a man named Peter, her secret lover. And that young man you saw? He's Peter's brother, David. He knows the truth but is too scared to talk." Joy's mind spun. She took the photos to the police. That night, they dug up Sarah's body near the strange house. The news spread fast. Mr. Johnson was shocked, swearing he thought Sarah ran away. Mrs. Clara and Peter had vanished, but Joy wasn't done. She went back to the strange house, determined to find David. The car led her there again, and this time, David was inside, pacing nervously. "You again," he shouted. Joy held up the locket. "I know about Sarah. Your brother Peter and Mrs. Clara killed her. Help me stop them. David hesitated, then sighed. I didn't want any part of it. Peter forced me to keep quiet. They buried her here, and I've been haunted ever since. He handed Joy a letter Sarah wrote the day she died, begging for help. She knew they were after her, David said, tears in his eyes. With the letter, photos, and David's story, Joy went to Mama Ruth again. Mama Ruth used her connections to track Mrs. Clara and Peter to a village near Lagos. The police raided their hideout in the dead of night. Inside, Mrs. Clara and Peter were arguing. You said no one would find out. Peter yelled. You messed it up. Mrs. Clara snapped back. Before they could escape, the police burst in. Peter grabbed the knife, but an officer tackled him. Mrs. Clara tried to run, but she was caught at the door. As they were handcuffed, another twist came. The police found a hidden box in their bags. Inside was a second locket, matching Sarah's, with Mrs. Clara's picture. She planned to frame Mr. Johnson completely, David whispered to Joy. She wanted his money and his ruin. Mrs. Clara screamed as they dragged her away, blaming Peter, but he shouted back, You're the monster. Both were arrested, their secrets exposed. Joy watched from a distance with Lisa and David as the police took them away. The car stood silent, no whispers, no ants. Sarah's spirit was free. A simple baker had uncovered a web of lies, all because she wanted an easier way to walk.